Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical.
The foundation of modern cybersecurity is to not trust anything or anybody. That's a quote from a recent article in The Conversation, and you'd be forgiven for feeling under constant threat of cyber attack in today's world. So how do we prepare ourselves for these inevitable threats? And how do you lead a cybersecurity industry dedicated to protecting our people and our institutions? Well, today I'm talking to Steve Durbin, CEO of the Information Security Forum. Since 1989, ISF has been working with most of the world's leading businesses to establish better cybersecurity. Thank you for joining us, Steve. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. Great to see you.
So, Steve, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
Gosh, I don't know that I've ever sort of seen myself as being radical. It's not the sort of thing that I've really sort of thought about. I've always had what I consider anyway to be a sort of healthy mistrust of the establishment, of things that, being the way that they are supposed to be. So I always sort of question things. And I did that from a very early age, which, as you can imagine, going through school and so on, probably didn't serve me as well as it might. But it did mean that I was naturally curious. And I think that was in part down to the fact that I grew up in Africa. So I grew up in Kenya. And so, at weekends we'd go to game parks and see lions and giraffes and all of that kind of thing. And what that did for me was give me this sort of view of the broadness of the overall sort of reach of possibility, of openness. And whilst I recognized that was, something of a privileged beginning, it did, I think, sort of frame the way that I tend to look at the world now, which is rather than the detail, trying to get the bigger picture so that you can put things into context. And that's, I suppose, an interesting perspective for somebody working in the cyber industry, where it is all about detail and trying to understand who's trying to get one over on you, if you look at it that way. So that's probably what began it all, really.
Really interesting, and actually quite a common theme with quite a few of our guests is, well, a couple of things, the kind of travel, living as part of other cultures, having exposure to that in their early life, but also living a life slightly different to their peers or being party to experiences that children not normally party to. So it sounds like you certainly have that. What's your enduring memory of your childhood in Africa?
This will probably sound very strange, but it's the smells.
Oh, really?
So you can always, and I still do it today, you can tell when it's about to rain because it smells differently. And so you use, I think, a lot more senses than perhaps you would otherwise. And again, that doesn't mean in the business world that, I walk in and smell people and that sort of is not.
Look out, everyone. When Steve starts frowning, he's giving you a smell. Yeah,
that's right. Always turn up with an air freshener in hand. No, but you are using a lot more of the senses. And that's usually useful, I think, in a business environment, which does from time to time become, less than multidimensional. So bringing some of those other elements to it, the energy in the room, people will talk about looking at sort of facial expression, those sorts of things. And I've always as well, I think, tried to sort of visualize. So even in the day when we didn't have things like Zoom or Teams or whatever video connection of choice might be, just talking to people on the phone, I always trying to visualize where they were, what they were doing, and so to try to bring to life the conversation in some way, shape or form.
I don't think the smells and the senses thing is relevant, actually, because there's two things that are occurring to me. First of all, that you talked about seeing the big picture in an industry where, as you mentioned, you might assume that actually a lot of people are very stuck in the weeds all the time. But also, clearly, you're someone who listens to their intuition quite a lot. And you'd imagine that in cybersecurity, there's a lot of rationalization and a lot of kind of thinking with the rational brain. Is that fair? Am I onto something about how you're a little bit different within your field?
I think there is. You always have to rationalize, don't you? I mean, the industry that I'm in and the job that I have as CEO, it's all about management of risk. That's it. There's nothing more complicated about it. And to manage that risk effectively, you need to take inputs from data, of course, but ultimately you're going to also allow the emotional side to come into play. So you're going to sense, you're going to feel, you feel something's right. And that's something that before I moved into this industry, I worked a lot with entrepreneurs. And that was a consistent theme with them. It feels right. Yes, it's informed by data. It's informed by opinion from other people that you trust. But ultimately, it's a gut feel. You always hear people talk about just go with your gut. And so I do tend to do that, backed up by data. And I think within the industry, we tend to very much, because I think we have to, be much more data-centric, data-driven. And that presents some challenges if a security professional is trying to convey messages to a business leader, for instance. And again, one of the challenges that we've seen for some while is, they don't speak the same language. It may be English, it may be American, it may be French, whatever it is, but they are viewing the world in slightly different ways. And so what I've always tried to do is to bridge that gap.
Really interesting and critical, whatever you're working in, actually, isn't it? Because you have those different communication styles, those different personalities in whatever business and whatever areas. So that's always very important. As an adult then, do you feel that you've become more radical or less radical? I mean, you started this, which is not uncommon for this podcast either, actually. People say, well, I don't actually think I'm radical at all. And then you start talking about your life and everyone's like, oh, actually, that is a bit different. But as you become an adult, progressed in your life and your career, do you think you've seen yourself getting more radical or less radical? What's been behind that?
I think I've always tended to still question. I've always tended to try to look for a different way of doing things. And, as I've sort of progressed professionally, I've sort of moved into roles where I've had more control over doing things differently. As you move up in an organization, you've got a lot more leeway. And so I probably allowed some of that mistrust of the status quo, of what's established, to come out more. And what I've tried to do as well is create an environment within the ISF where people can challenge. They shouldn't be afraid to challenge, not for the sake of challenging it, but because that's a useful, constructive process to go through. And, if you allow that, you will foster much more creative thinking, which will overcome some of the more standard challenges that businesses face. I was a consultant as well. I was a consultant for quite a while. I worked with government in some instances, particularly in Ministry of Defence, and it used to drive me crazy. The process you have to follow, the speed at which they tend to react. And I'm not being critical of them. It's just that's an example for me of an area that I really can't work in. I can't work in a heavily process-driven, fairly dogmatic environment, and that's necessary in certain jobs, clearly. So I think as I've matured, really come more clear on the areas that I'm good at, and have learned to stay away from those areas where somebody else is probably better placed to have a crack at it.
I think that's worth dwelling on for a second, because I think it is something that people earlier in their career think, I've got to pick everything up, I've got to run with it. If I'm bad at something, I've got to improve that, and I've got to become good at it. And the more things that I'm currently bad at that I become good at, the further I'll go. And actually, as you progress and you realize that the most effective people are just kind of open about what they're bad at, quote unquote, and clear about what they're good at as well. And they're put in positions where their strengths can carry the organization forward, right? And it's not about forcing people to be good at the things that they really struggle with.
That's absolutely right, Rob. And, the worst thing you can do, I think, particularly in a business context, is try to put a square peg into a round hole. People who understand what they're good at also understand what they're bad at, to your point. And so what I've done is try to assemble around me a team of people who are good at the things I'm not so good at. And, you bring them in to work with you to plug those gaps, to make sure that the team is so much stronger. And, the job then of the leader, if you like, is to make sure that everybody understands the direction that we're heading in, why we're doing it. And there's this commonality of purpose. And that then tends to breed passion, which becomes infectious. And that really, I think, makes for a much more dynamic, interesting workplace than everybody trying to do their best to get everything done, because, you have to be good at this sort of broad brush range of things that clearly businesses need to crack in order to function effectively. So know what you're good at and ditch what you're not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've talked about process. I kind of think performance management and appraisal has something to answer for here as well, because it's been a very easy process to adapt, where it's just, okay, people will progress by ticking more boxes ultimately. And actually that can't always be the case. Right? It can't just be they just keep doing more and more and more and more and more and more. It's about their impact. How are they growing their impact in the right way that's aligned with the vision, I would say.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that. And I think as the cyber industry matures, as technology continues to mature, people say to me, we can use this bit of kit or we can use that bit of software. But what they always seem to forget is that there are people involved in using that as well. And technology will fail. It always does. And when it fails, the people who get it back up and running again are the ones normally that people just probably didn't pay too much attention to because technology was the answer. And so for me, every successful business at the heart of it has a focus on people. And that is the most complex and difficult challenge for any business leader. How you manage people consistently over the years to deliver what you need them to deliver in an environment where you've got, mixed cultures, mixed age groups, mixed geographies. That's the real challenge, I think, of business. And that's the piece that is probably the most interesting.
Absolutely. Let's move on to your work and give us an introduction to ISF and who you are, what you're doing, who the members are. And it would be really good as well to understand that context we're in, that kind of quite scary dystopian intro I gave about cyber attacks. But what is the context we find ourselves in?
So ISF is a not-for-profit organization headquartered in London. It has been around for 36 years. So very long time when you think about the cyber industry, go right the way back. And it was an entirely different world. It was the world of the floppy disk, I'm told, and very simple sort of process stuff that was being put together to try to protect data, roll it forward to where we are today in 2025. And it's an entirely different concept. It's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's how do you protect data, which is the most valuable commodity of any business, while it's at rest, at movement across multiple geographies. And we work with, as you said, some of the world's largest organizations all around the world, from Australia right the way across Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and the Americas, and of course the UK, to try to come up with insights into the way that the industry is moving and evolving so that people can better prepare themselves for the future. Software tools so that they can actually make use of things to help with risk assessment, for instance, or comparing themselves with other organizations in terms of their security and maturity standards, how to deal with regulation. These are all things that are evolving now in the industry as it matures. And then also providing some networking environments that are closed to our members. So they have this safety, security of knowing that what they say to each other is really being said under Chatham House rule. And so it's a very open sharing community that I think helps people to really build out resilience, which is what everybody's trying to do in their organization. Because of course it isn't just about if you're going to get attacked, it's about when you're going to get attacked and how you're going to respond to that. And that, in a nutshell, is what we do. Try to anticipate some of the threats that our members will be facing and provide them with whatever level of support is appropriate to build out that resilience. And if they're unfortunate enough to be attacked, of course, to try to help them get back up and going again.
What are the big existential threats that we face in data security and cybersecurity at the minute? It feels like it's a lot more dangerous now. Is that true? Or is that a kind of a perception that is not necessarily accurate? It's just how we feel about it because we know more about it.
I think it is more, I don't know if dangerous is the right word, but I would say it's certainly riskier. So as I say, everything revolves around data. If you think about it, you think about what you do in the morning, you'll probably wake up and you probably at some point within about the first 5 minutes of waking up, most people will go for their phone and they'll check something. They might check email, they might check social media, whatever it is. And they will probably share something. We will then do all of our banking online. We will track our kids to see whether or not they've got to school. We'll then go into work or work from home. We'll be combining the devices we use for personal with work. We'll be sharing things. All of that data is of interest to somebody, and we often forget that. That's why I say it's riskier, not more dangerous. We also know that cyber criminals love to make use of technology, love to access data. They may not be able to make a great deal of use of it today, but they're very patient and they can store that data and they might use it at some point in the future. So we always have to, I think, be on our guard when we're using technology. And that is the biggest challenge, as far as I can see, because people, for some unknown reason, seem to imagine, I'm sure there's good psychological reasons for it, and a psychologist will tell you exactly what's going on. But when we go onto our screens, whether it be a phone, whether it be a laptop, whatever it might be, we somehow feel safe. So we're Googling away, looking at whatever, and we think we're safe, because it's just us. It's just me and this thing that I'm working with. And the reality is that every time you step onto the internet, you're into the Wild West. It's an unregulated environment. And your data, once you put it out there, it cannot be taken down. It's there. It's living on the web somewhere. So if you've got that, hugely powerful tool that's at everybody's fingertips, you would think that we would be spending much more time than we actually are teaching children, in the beginning anyway, how to use that technology. It's a more powerful piece of equipment than a Formula One racing car in terms of what you can do with it. And yet we just hand it off to people and off you go. And then we sit back and we worry and look amazed at the fact that we've actually been phished, or we've been breached, or we've lost our data. And it must be somebody else's fault. And how did it happen? And that's really, I think, what's at the basis of the way in which the world is moving from the individual standpoint. So it is riskier. We do need to teach and educate people how to better use technology, how to be better in cyber, how to be safer online. And everybody has a role in that: parents, governments, businesses. And then if you move into the business environment, then the data that's being handled there is of immense value. So just from little old you or me doing whatever we're doing, multiply that by many, many times, and you can be able to consider the challenge that the business faces. And businesses are under attack every single moment of the day. If you look at financial services, banks are constantly under attack. Why? Because that's where the useful stuff is. And as technology continues to develop with things like artificial intelligence, so too does the ability to spread misinformation, disinformation, access data which can be then used, changed, attack via cyber, critical national infrastructure. And so the world has become a much more dangerous place because of our dependence upon technology and the flaws that exist within technology that allow criminals, malicious actors, to actually come in, fiddle with it, change it, take it down, do whatever they want with it. So the world is a very dangerous place. But we're not suddenly going to switch off all of our technology. What we have to do is continually educate, continually focus on the fact that we need to be building in resilience, which is how do I recover when I lose stuff in a very simple way? And how do we make it much more difficult for the bad guys? And I always say, you want to be that guy in the bar who's at the end of the bar drooling into his beer that nobody really wants to go and talk to. Because what you want to do is be so unattractive to a cyber criminal that they'll move on to an easier target.
So you want to make yourself so unattractive, unappealing that no one can see anything of value there. No one's coming anywhere near. Right, okay. How does one do that? What sort of things might you do if you want to be this guy drooling into his pint?
It's a really good question. And part of it, at the individual level, being aware of what you post on social media. If you're constantly posting the fact that you're in Dubai in a Michelin star restaurant, then you're going to be of interest because you must have a certain amount of wealth or net value in order to be able to do that sort of thing. So you're raising a flag. So you could be of interest to a cyber criminal. You have to remember, cyber criminals are constantly on reconnaissance missions. So they're constantly scanning, they're constantly looking for opportunities. That industry has developed so much. We've now got crime as a service, which is very well established, where, anybody can go onto the dark web and buy packages for dropping malware with 24-hour support lines. The cost is pretty minimal. And that's the way of the world.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that before. Cybercrime as a service. So I can go onto the dark web and I can basically search, I want to run this sort of scam. And there's someone who's developed the software to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll have reviews on there. And as I say, it'll have a 24/7 helpline.
Reviews, 5 stars, would recommend. Scammed $1 million. Yeah. Goodness me. Yeah. Makes sense, I suppose. Why would this marketplace operate any differently to the legitimate marketplaces in the world?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. Gosh. You have mentioned that your passion is around the people, equipping people with the skills to operate technology for when technology fails. Expand on that a little bit more and maybe talk us through some examples where you see that working well, or maybe there aren't examples where you think it's smashed it out the park and you can identify the gaps for us.
What you're always trying to do, right, as a leader within any organization, is to get the best from your people. So if you start with that premise, you have to create the right environment. Part of that environment is around education, a whole range of different levels. And so you have to invest time, effort, money in the people. If you then roll that into the business environment, what I'm expecting our guys to then do with our client base, with our member base, is to impart that knowledge as well. It may be because they understand, how to operate a certain bit of technology, or they may understand how to assess risk in a particular way. But a good example would be in something that we've been doing a tremendous amount of work in over the last probably 18, 24 months, which is helping companies plan for attacks and to see how they can respond to that. So cyber simulation exercises. And within the ISF, because of our member base, we have the ability not only to roll those things out for organizations at all levels, from the board level right the way down, but also to be able to compare and contrast them with other organizations on an anonymous basis in their industry. So they can see how they're performing in terms of their ability to react. And we run those all around the world. And that really enables an organization in a very sort of non-judgmental way to understand where it needs to be focusing in order to, when they are attacked, be able to respond effectively. It helps train their teams as to how they should be responding, who has to do what, because when these things happen, you tend to get yourself in a space where things aren't working. You can have people panicking. I remember talking to one chief information security officer who was telling me that one of the biggest challenges that he had when they'd had an attack through a global organization is that a lot of people didn't want to step away from their keyboards and to basically rest. They wanted to carry on trying to fix the problem. And that again is something back to the people element that you can't afford to have happen. So you're trying to cover off all of the different elements of what goes on when attacks happen. And that's what we tend to try to do in the cyber exercises that we run, and then help people to deal with that and come up with the right sort of plans to roll out across their organization. But it begins within the ISF. It begins with our people training, educating, and then we take that on into the member base. And hopefully members then take it on into their own organizations and share some of those things with others too. So that's just one of the ways in which we try to do it.
I'm imagining within a large organization, especially just because you've got a sheer volume of people, but is there a problem in making some of this information accessible? I think a lot of people instantly recoil when they hear information security or cybersecurity, thinking this is going to be very technical. I'm never going to understand it. How do you deal with that kind of accessibility challenge? I'm imagining that's something you help organizations with as well.
Yeah, you're right. Before I moved into cyber, I worked at EY and did quite a bit in the sort of M&A space, and before that when I was at Gartner as well. And all of my time there, whenever we were doing any M&A, we would never involve anybody from the security space because they would just slow things down. Didn't want them there at all. I didn't even know they existed, actually. That's how bad it was about 16 years ago.
What a journey you've been on, Steve. What a journey.
Exactly, yeah. You talk about how do you overcome some of that. One of the things I really miss in organizations now is that we aren't as regularly all together in one place. So because we've got work from home and that kind of thing, at remote working. You miss out on one of the key sort of awareness opportunities is when people used to go into the coffee machine, at water coolers, the kitchen, whatever it was. And that provided an environment for you to share sort of stories and raise awareness. So the best way for organizations to do that today is through in-the-moment training that allows them to provide people with support, guidance in the moment. So, for instance, you could be sitting at home, you might be on your laptop, you might click on a link, and you'll get a message that comes through that tells you that it was a phishing test, or so you shouldn't have clicked on it, and this is why, and it will lead you through and educate you. So education in the moment is hugely important. I also think, though, that it's about helping people to understand how they fit within the organization. And so this is one of my, big beefs with compliance. Compliance, yes, okay, it will make sure that you are compliant, you're doing something, but it doesn't actually help educate the person that you want to do it. They don't understand necessarily the context for that. And so sound compliance doesn't necessarily equal good security. Good security normally does equal good or sound compliance. So what you're trying to do is to help everybody in your organization understand the role that they play in the organization, the importance of what they do, and these are all, good things from an employee satisfaction perspective, but also the importance of them handling data technology appropriately and the impact that it can have if they get it wrong. Not in a judgmental way, but simply explaining and laying it all out. So some of the most effective pieces of awareness training that I've seen really make it very personal. So if you think about it, what are people really worried about? Well, most people with children, for instance, are worried about their kids accessing stuff online, cyberbullying, all of that kind of thing. So if you can wrap awareness training around something that is important to the individual, they're much more inclined to remember it. They're much more inclined to tell their friends about it, and they're much more inclined to put it into practice. So it's about thinking through some of those things, making it very simple, helping people to understand why you're asking them to do things rather than just do it. And that probably goes back to what we talked about earlier, where I just naturally challenge rules. My first question is always why. So try to hit that one on the head first off. And also reward people for doing the right thing. Make a big noise about it. Because again, as I say, it's all about people at the end of the day. It's not about the technology.
So interesting. You've taken me back to one of our earliest episodes, earliest guests, Linnea Bywall. She's a psychologist, and explaining that there's something ridiculously high, like, I'm going to get the number specifically wrong, but indicatively 70% of adopting a new behavior is actually being positively reinforced for that behavior, not actually learning it, not being informed about it. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that's a fantastic thing to highlight. As we come to the end of the work section, Steve, I want to take us in a slightly different direction, because this is one of the rare privileges for me where I'm speaking to a fellow podcaster, and you host a podcast with some incredibly high profile guests on it. Tell us a little bit about that, and what has that given you? What have you learned, and how has that informed your work, having those conversations?
Yeah, the ISF podcast's been around for a number of years now. It's going really well. And you're right, I've had the opportunity to talk to some really interesting people, from people like, Chris Hadfield, the astronaut, Sir Bob Geldof, Boomtown Rats, former prime ministers, Steve Wozniak, founder of Apple, some really interesting people. And in the beginning, when I sort of started talking about the fact that I wanted to do a podcast with those kinds of individuals, everybody sort of looked at me and said, well, what's that would do with security? The reality is that what I've always tried to do on the podcast is to get interesting people to talk about interesting things. And then it's my job to try to apply that to the security or my audience needs. So did one fairly recently with Paul McKenna, for instance, where we talked about stress in the workplace. Well, the cyber industry, it's hugely stressful. We have all sorts of problems in that area. So again, perhaps superficially, people might sort of look at it and say, well, what's Paul McKenna know about security? Well, he probably doesn't know very much. In fact, he isn't that interested. But Paul knows a tremendous amount about how to deal with stress. It's about making those kinds of links. And the richness, if you like, of the podcast is that we don't follow any particular set formula. And for some of my podcast guests, that's been a bit challenging because they like to have structure and that kind of thing. And so Tavia, my producer, does her best to make them feel comfortable by sending them all these questions beforehand that she knows full well I'll never ask. And then when we actually get them on, again, my job is to simply have a conversation so we forget about the questions. And we just chat away for whatever it is, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then, Tavia makes it sound good at the end of it. And people listen to it and everybody seems to enjoy it. So
brilliant. This is all sounding very familiar. Previous guests will know my email has all these questions, and I say in bold, I probably won't ask these, but this is mostly so you remember who I am, what we're doing, and get you thinking before we join, So we must come on to the last section now, Steve. It's a little bit radical world. So what's a little bit of a radical idea for the world that you would like people to get behind, big or small?
I really love people to put their phones away more. And the context for that is that we live in a really fascinating world. And one of the sad things, and you see this all the time, right? It doesn't matter whether you're going to a restaurant, whether you're on holiday, wherever you are, you'll always see people with their phones out taking pictures of either what they're about to eat or some building or animals or whatever it happens to be. They're not actually looking and experiencing any of that. What they're doing is taking a damn picture of it so they can put it up on social media. And I just look at it and I think, well, yeah, that's great. I mean, I take pictures, I'm a pretty avid photographer. I have my own sort of photography site and, really into sort of landscapes and that kind of thing. But I'm not always taking pictures. I'm taking time to try to understand my environment in order to better frame the picture. And so that sort of transactional nature of life that we've been sort of drawn into, where it's important to keep posting, that's something I'd like people to just sort of, think about a little bit more before they do it and just experience, taste the food before you take a picture. And then you're better informed to say, it may look good, but God, it was awful. Or add a bit of personality to it. So yeah, that's what I'd really like.
Well, I'm sure you'll get plenty of support from listeners for that one. As a former food blogger and minutely successful food influencer, I personally got sick of having to take photos of my food all the time, to be honest with you. But I think pictures is one thing, and I get that. But the thing I understand the least, I'd say, I can sort of understand taking pictures of nice things that you want to remember, but it's when people are sat together and they're on their phones talking to other people. That I don't understand. That I just really don't understand. Can't get my head around that at all. But I'm sure you'll get lots of support for that one. Sadly, we've come to the end now, Steve. It's been wonderful to chat to you. Quite a far-reaching conversation. But the last question is always the same, which is that if there's someone listening who has a little bit of a radical idea for a business, a project they want to start, something in their personal life, but they don't quite know where to get started, what advice would you give them?
I think if you're in that bucket, you're really passionate about something and you don't know how to get going, then reach out to other people who've done something similar or not. I've worked with a tremendous number of entrepreneurs and over the years, and I could not name one that has said to me that they are not prepared, if somebody really reaches out to them and asks for advice, to take just a few minutes to reply and to give some advice and guidance. But we all love doing that. I don't have a huge number of people that do that with me, but the ones that do, I always take the time to try to help out, because the world of business can be very daunting. And I think there are a number of people out there who've got some fantastic ideas and they simply don't know how to put them into action. And there are other people out there who've probably got some experience and are willing to do it. So don't be afraid to just ask. And that's where technology really can help.
Yes, absolutely. Send those LinkedIn messages, but not those horrible salesy ones.
Oh, exactly. No.
The nice ones that ask for advice. One of our recent episodes was Matt Herbert, great guy, New Zealander, who started a marketing data platform called Tracksuit. And he and his co-founders started their business by having the concept for something, and then they just wanted to speak to CMOs who were their target audience. So they made a list of the top 100 CMOs in New Zealand. And there's a quote from the interview, which is something like, by the time we got the 83rd yes from this group of CMOs willing to talk to us about this idea, we kind of knew we were onto something. So yeah, I think that's great advice. Don't be afraid to ask for help and ask for a discussion. Don't be anxious about your idea being stolen, because that doesn't really happen. Well, Steve, thank you so much for giving us your time today. Brilliant conversation, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.